After studying this module, you will be able to know what the older measures of economic development are, learn how they were calculated, identify what their merits and demerits were, evaluate how useful these measures are, analyze what these measures reveal about countries. Before studying various economic indicators, let us look at the older measures of economic development. In Europe from the 16th to 18th century, the prevailing economic ideas were mercantilist. They considered the accumulation of bullion, that is, gold and silver, and other precious metals, as the main indicators of a country's prosperity. In the 18th century, French physiocratic ideas became popular, especially in the latter half of the century. These ideas emphasized agriculture or land based activity as the source of a nation's wealth. In 1776, Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, through the ideas of classical economics, introduced the term national income as an indicator of nations' prosperity. This national income began to be seen as produced by land, labor, and capital, with improved technology and increasing specialization through division of labor. Now, as classical economics attached great importance to the role of population, which was growing fast in Europe at that time, there developed the concept of national income per head of population. Per capita income, which, like the national income, was an annual and monetary measure.
Now, what are we going to learn in this section of the paper? We are going to learn about how to measure and quantify economic growth, economic development, and so on. This is really the quantification of the concept of economic development that we have learnt in the earlier module. You see, initially, when economics developed as a subject, the mercantilists were the first people who used to think about it in the 16th to 18th century. To them, economic development or economic growth was measured by the accumulation of bullion, that is, gold and silver and other precious metals. Later on, money. Then came the time of the physiocrats. These physiocrats belonged to the 18th century, and they identified the growth of a country with agricultural growth. So, a country's agricultural output was the indicator of economic development according to the physiocrats. Then came the classical era, ushered in by Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations. He defined wealth of nations as the general economic progress, the national income as developed by land, labor, capital with improved technology and increasing division of labor. The distribution of the national income, the growth of the national income became the important indicator of economic growth. Also, population began to grow in Europe at this time, and because the classical economists were also concerned with the role of population, they developed the additional concept of per capita income, that is, national income not just in a total or aggregate sense, but per head, per capita national income. By late 19th century, national income was an accepted indicator of the economic status of a country. Most countries, when they talked of economic prosperity, growth, development, etc., they talked of national income or gross national income, and of course the per capita measure of it.
Now let's understand the modern indicators of economic development, starting with gross national product (GNP), which is the market value of all the products and services produced in one year by the citizens of a country, including income of those abroad. A higher GNP is generally indicative of a higher level of economic development. Another indicator of economic development is the gross domestic product (GDP). The GDP, as distinct from GNP, is a measure of the market value of all goods and services produced within the domestic boundaries of a country within a year. As a money measure, it is called nominal GDP. Adjusted for the price level, it is called the real GDP. One important observation that could be seen in the late 1970s was that people become critical of per capita income or GNP as a measure of economic development. The reason being, first, being expressed in terms of money, if there is inflation, the nominal GNP becomes an overestimate. Secondly, it does not reveal how unequally the total national product or income may be spread over the various income groups. Thirdly, it is a money measure and ignores all non market activities, even if they enhance standard of living or even household income. Finally, there are differences in the costs of living among countries that are not fully reflected in the exchange rates. A solution to this has been found in adjusting per capita income figures for such differences, resulting in what is called purchasing power parity.
Now, this gross national product or gross national income is really the market value of all the products and services produced in one year by the citizens of a country, including the income of those abroad, generated abroad but belonging to this country. Another indicator of economic development developed, and that was the gross domestic product as distinct from gross national product or national income. The GDP as distinct from GNP is a measure of the money value of goods and services produced within the domestic boundaries of a country. This is very important to observe, that it is produced within the domestic boundaries of a country within a year. It is like the GNP, a money measure, and if we take it as a money measure, it is called the nominal GDP or nominal gross domestic product. However, one can adjust it for price level, and when we adjust the nominal GDP for inflation, etc., it is known as the real GDP. GNP and GDP may sometimes differ substantially because many countries earn a lot of income from activities abroad. So, if that is not taken into account, the GDP may be quite different from what the GNP is. In general, however, what happened was that around 1934, Professor Simon Kuznets, he really popularized the GDP as more important than GNP as a measure of economic development. After the Second World War, GDP and GDP per capita, that is GDP divided by the population, these became the more popular, more used measures rather than GNP or national income. From the 1990s, all over the world, it is GDP which is used as the primary or basic indicator of economic development rather than GNP. Now, various economies have different sizes, various economies have different levels of GDP, and we find that certain countries like Sweden, like USA and so on, they are very high up so far as the GDP or even GDP per capita goes. India has a GDP of 1875213 rupees and is ranked 10th among all the 193 countries that are generally studied. But by the late 1970s, people became critical of per capita income or GDP, even GDP and so on, as a measure. So they really thought of finding out other alternatives. One major alternative was to adjust the GDP, GNP by the differences in the cost of living in different countries or the purchasing power of different countries. Each country has a different rate of inflation. So if you adjust by them, the resulting figure, whether of GNP, whether of GDP, whatever, is known as the unit adjusted for purchasing power parity, PPP. So PPP estimates, if we take, they differ somewhat from the unadjusted or nominal values of GDP, GNP, and so on. So this has to be kept in mind when we look at the scenario, the international scenario especially. For example, India ranks 148 with a PPP US dollar of 1516 in around 2012. Pakistan, the rank is 155, and the last is Somalia with a PPP of US dollar 128. Needless to say, Sweden, USA, these are towards the top.
The dissatisfaction or disillusionment with the GNP or even the GDP based measures led to the development of the Physical Quality of Life Index (PQLI). There was a need to create a practical measure of social distribution that will avoid the limitations of the GNP, minimize cultural and developmental ethnocentricity, and be internationally comparable. Considering this, Morris D. Morris constructed a new measure called Physical Quality of Life Index (PQLI). Morris D. Morris combined the three indicators, viz., infant mortality, life expectancy, calculated at or before the age of 1 year, and basic literacy in a simple or unweighted average. Each indicator is placed on a fixed 1 to 100 scale. The three indicators having been placed on a common scale, the index is found by the summation of the equally weighted indicators. The PQLI is thus a composite of these three basic statistics. To calculate the PQLI for a country, we have to find its literacy rate, indexed infant mortality rate 166 minus infant mortality into 0.625, indexed life expectancy is equal to life expectancy minus 42 into 2.7, sum up and divide by 3. The advantages of PQLI are: the procedure is of extreme simplicity, the chosen variables do relate to the bulk of the population of the country, the index is free from market value considerations because it includes no elements expressed in national currencies. It is also neutral in respect of political and allied structural organization of a country, thus facilitating inter-country comparison. It is also relatively unaffected by cultural diversities. Because of its simplicity, it is easily understood by policy makers and laymen.
Now, GDP, even when you adjust it by purchasing power, etc., it is not a complete solution. It is, after all, an average solution. It does not take into account the inequality, inequity, dispersion, so on and so forth. So, we do not say that either of these measures, whether taken in nominal terms or whether adjusted for differences in purchasing power, none of them are perfect. In fact, what was attempted as a kind of an offshoot of this was the Physical Quality of Life Index, which was developed as early as 1978 by economist Morris D. Morris. Morris D. Morris said that we should take into account other dimensions which indicate not just the quantitative aspects of an economy's progress. We should take care of the health standards, educational standards, and so on. So, the quality of life rather than the quantity of national income. The quality is, of course, dependent on the quantity. I mean, you can't have a country with a high quality of life which has a very poor national income or GDP, as we may call it. You have to also have substantial quantifiable economic progress, but there are other dimensions to life, and he combined three different indicators into what is known as the PQLI, Physical Quality of Life Index. One is infant mortality, life expectancy is another, and basic literacy is yet another. All these three, they indicate whether the country has achieved a certain amount of GDP and living standards are better and so on. You cannot, for example, have a very low infant mortality rate if the economy does not have a high level of GDP. The things are dependent, the units are dependent. Nevertheless, this is not, it's a composite measure, but this measure also is not perfect. It has several loopholes. For example, calculating the literacy rate, calculating the infant mortality rate, calculating the life expectancy, to index them, to adjust them, and so on, it's difficult. In fact, there are no continuous series of the PQLI calculated for any economy in the world. There have been attempts, for example, there has been an attempt in India by Mukherjee, Ray, and Rajya Lakshmi in 1979, which have tried to calculate it for different states in India and so on. But again, you can't compare it, they're just not available in that form that you can compare all the countries and all the states and so on with the PQLI. Maurice de Morris himself pointed out several defects, that it is, it does not have enough data, it is affected by the quality of data, it does not measure all social psychological aspects of growth and so on.
Let's learn the concept of the Human Development Index. HDI is a summary composite index that measures a country's average achievements in three basic aspects of human development: longevity, knowledge, and a decent standard of living. Longevity is measured by life expectancy at birth. Knowledge is measured by a combination of the adult literacy rate and the combined primary, secondary, and tertiary gross enrollment ratio, and standard of living by GDP per capita. Now let's look at the methodology used to calculate Human Development Index. Till 2010, the United Nations Development Programme used to combine the following three dimensions: life expectancy at birth as an index of population health and longevity, knowledge and education as measured by the adult literacy rate with two-thirds weighting, and the combined primary, secondary, and tertiary gross enrollment ratio with one-third weighting. Standard of living as indicated by the natural logarithm of gross domestic product per capita at purchasing power parity. In general, to transform a raw variable, say x, into a unit-free index between 0 and 1, which allows different indices to be added together, the formula used is x minus minimum x divided by maximum x minus minimum x, where minimum x and maximum x are the lowest and highest values the variable can attain respectively. The Human Development Index (HDI) then represents the uniformly weighted sum with one-third contributed by each of the following factor indices. Life expectancy index is equal to life expectancy minus 25 divided by 85 minus 25. Education index equals two-third weighting adult literacy index plus one-third weighting gross enrollment index, where adult literacy index equals adult literacy rate minus 0 divided by 100 minus 0, and gross enrollment index equals combined gross enrollment rate minus 0 divided by 100 minus 0. GDP is equal to natural logarithm of gross domestic product per capita at purchasing power parity minus log of 100 divided by log of 40,000 minus log of 100. The World Index of Human Development is also calculated. Since 2010, a slightly different formula is being used. The following three normalized indices are calculated and then their geometrical mean is taken. Life expectancy index LEI is equal to life expectancy minus 20 divided by 82.3 minus 20. Education index EI equals under root of mean years of schooling index multiplied by expected years of schooling index divided by 0.951. Income index II is equal to log of gross national product per capita at purchasing power parity log of 100 divided by log of 40,000 minus log of 100. Each year, HDIs of the various member countries of the UN are calculated and the countries ranked accordingly into four tiers or levels of economic development: very high, high, medium, and low. The statistical tools used to calculate HDI help assess the relative economic status or standing of countries as well as their progress or regression, that is, movement up or down the ladder of the rankings. At present, Norway is at top among all the member countries.
Now, GDP even when you adjust it by purchasing power, etc., it is not a complete solution. It is, after all, an average solution. It does not take into account the inequality, inequity, dispersion, so on and so forth. So we do not say that either of these measures, whether taken in nominal terms or whether adjusted for differences in purchasing power, none of them are perfect. In fact, what was attempted as a kind of an offshoot of this was the physical quality of life index, which was developed as early as 1978 by economist Maurice de Morris. Maurice de Morris said that we should take into account other dimensions which indicate not just the quantitative aspects of an economy's progress. We should take care of the health standards, educational standards, and so on. So the quality of life rather than the quantity of national income. The quality is, of course, dependent on the quantity. I mean, you can't have a country with a high quality of life which has a very poor national income, or GDP as we may call it. You have to also have substantial quantifiable economic progress. But there are other dimensions to life, and he combined three different indicators into what is known as the PQLI, Physical Quality of Life Index. One is infant mortality, life expectancy is another, and basic literacy is yet another. All these three, they indicate whether the country has achieved a certain amount of GDP and living standards are better, and so on. You cannot, for example, have a very low infant mortality rate if the economy does not have a high level of GDP. The things are dependent, the units are dependent. Nevertheless, this is not, it's a composite measure, but this measure also is not perfect. It has several loopholes. For example, calculating the literacy rate, calculating the infant mortality rate, calculating the life expectancy, to index them, to adjust them, and so on, it's difficult. In fact, there are no continuous series of the PQLI calculated for any economy in the world. There have been attempts. For example, there has been an attempt in India by Mukherjee, Ray, and Rajya Lakshmi in 1979, which have tried to calculate it for different states in India and so on. But again, you can't compare it, they're just not available in that form that you can compare all the countries and all the states and so on with the PQLI. Maurice de Morris himself pointed out several defects, that it is, it does not have enough data, it is affected by the quality of data, it does not measure all social psychological aspects of growth, and so on.
World HDI is then calculated by taking geometric mean of previously mentioned indices, which is given by cube root of life expectancy rate, X education index, X income index. The HDI is most relevant in assessing the economic development of various countries. The indices used to calculate HDI provide, in a nutshell, information about a country's material welfare as well as its health, education, and other aspects. A high HDI indicates that the country has a substantial GDP, its people enjoy a high standard of living, good hygienic conditions, and ample medical facilities, and general access to education. A low HDI indicates the lack of all this. India falls in the category of medium human development with an HDI of 0.547 and a rank of 134.
The most important, the most popular, the most well known index nowadays is the Human Development Index. The Human Development Index, HDI, is a summary composite index. That means that it is composed of or made up of two or three different indices. So it's a summary composite index that measures a country's average achievements in three basic aspects of human development: longevity, knowledge, and a decent standard of living. Longevity is measured by life expectancy at birth. That is, when an infant is born, what is the expectation? How long will that infant survive? It used to be pretty low in India once, now it has certainly improved. The second is knowledge. The aspect of knowledge is measured by two things: a combination of adult literacy rate and the primary, secondary, and tertiary gross enrollment ratio. That is, how many are there enrolled, let us say at secondary levels, higher levels, and so on, and do not drop off. The standard of living is measured by good old GDP per capita. So since 1992, the United Nations Development Programme UNDP has been regularly bringing out annual development reports which try to bring to us all these HDIs calculated for all the members of the UN. In course of working on it, these are the people who have made substantial contributions: Mahbub ul Haq, Amartya Sen, Paul Streeton, Francis Stewart, Gustav Ranis, Keith Griffin, Sudhir Anand, and Meghnad Desai. You will observe that Indians have made substantial contribution to the development of this. This Human Development Index has to be calculated in somewhat a complex manner. You have to take account of various data, methodology, and so on, and it still has to be modified. In fact, it has been modified in several ways. You improve upon it and so on. Nevertheless, it is being calculated fairly regularly, and we find that very many countries of the world are kind of positioned in respect to one another through this HDI. For example, you have the very high section, you have the high segment, you have the medium segment, and you have the low segment. These statistical tools help us to indicate whether a country has achieved certain growth or development from a low level to a high level, or from high level to very high level, and so on. So these rates, these indicators have done a lot to make us, to enable us to compare how far the world as such has progressed in terms of development. For example, the Human Development Report 2011 says that there are 47 countries which can be said to have achieved very high human development, Norway being the first, USA is fourth in rank, and so on. Again, 47 countries have not very high but high human development, and 44 countries are there with medium human development. Where do you think India is? India falls in this medium development category with a human development index of 0.547 and a rank of 134. There are 46 countries with low human development, and the last here is the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Human Development Index, this index that we have been talking about, is not above criticism. Firstly, it is built on incomplete and inexact data. Data is a very important consideration here, and then it excludes countries which are not members of the UN, so it's not really giving you a complete picture of the world. It's affected by the formula and so on, and besides, it's very much in the Western model, does not take account of other aspects. There are countries which prefer to have a simple living, high thinking kind of consideration. This is not reflected here. Ecological considerations, more importantly, it does not take care of the sustainability, the equity, these aspects, or technological aspects, etc. So it has always got a scope for improvement. Nevertheless, it is important, and the human development approach has enduring relevance in making sense of our world and addressing the challenges now and in the future. This is what the Human Development Report of 2011 had said. One may improve the indices, one may improve the measure, but the approach has to be the approach of human development in order to study economic development.
Let's now study of critical comments on the HDI. The Human Development Index has been criticized on a number of grounds. It is built on incomplete and inexact data. It excludes countries that are not members of the UN and is, to that extent, incomplete and inaccurate. Any changes in its formula, however appropriate, breaks the continuity of the series. It assesses development differently in different groups of countries. It has an ideological bias towards egalitarianism and Western model of development and ignoring moral and spiritual aspects of human development that may be found in the East. It does not include any ecological considerations. It does not consider technological development or contributions to science and civilization. It measures aspects of development that have already been exhaustively studied and so is redundant. It focuses exclusively on national performance and ranking and does not look at development from a global perspective.
So this module, if we may summarize it, it enables you people to know how measures of economic development developed and how from mid 20th century GDP has been accepted as an important indicator of economic development, how further on it has also been augmented by the physical quality of life index, and how further later, since the early 1990s, the Human Development Index has emerged as the most important indicator of economic development. This summary, therefore, would show a pointer to this, that Human Development Index is a very important development in this area.